Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Outside the Studio. My name is Tessa. I am your host. I'm really excited to bring to you a special guest today, an author, a medical doctor, a rock musician, a business executive, very eclectic and versatile human being. Welcome to the show, Kevin. Is it Krenitsky?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Oh,
hi, Tessa.
Hi. Welcome.
Yeah.
How are you doing today?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing really well. It's Friday for me. Well, it is for you too. I guess I'm saying it's Friday because I don't release these podcasts like on the day that they're recording. So when you ask me how I'm doing and I say it's Friday, I'm like, yes, the weekend is around the corner and I'm looking forward to that. So I want to talk to you a lot today about your book. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'm holding it up. The book is called The Still Point, The Simplicity of Spiritual Enlightenment. And I think where I want to start with this is asking you about the title. Why The Still Point?
Yeah, the title, The Still Point, interestingly came to me one day about 4 years before the book was written, just sitting quietly in meditation. And a thought came that a book called The Still Point would be written. I didn't really like the title that much. And, when I started to actually write the book, which didn't happen for about 4 years after that, kind of try to change it, and nothing would really come. And I then kind of felt like perhaps this is what it was meant to be. And the still point is really just another word for what has been described as in the perennial philosophy as our true nature. So you can, this has been referred to as consciousness, awareness, the Tao, Holy Spirit, presence, the now. These are all synonymous terms, and the still point is simply another one, another word that points to that true reality, if you will.
Yeah. Okay. So yes. How do we recognize the still point within ourselves? I mean, I think it feels like such an intangible thing to say. This is our human nature. So I guess there's two questions that I have. One is, the first question, how do we recognize it in our being? And two is, why is it so hard for us to be still? I mean, it feels like such a chaotic present day culture that we live in. I'm not sure if I've come to the decision that this is our human nature or not, or like the circumstance of our culture. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, when you said it's intangible, I think that's very true. It's completely intangible, and it's non-objective. It's formless, and as a result of that, even though it is our own being is the most intimate experience we have, it's overlooked. It's vastly and almost completely overlooked in modern society. The way that the best way that I've found to recognize this, if you will, is, as mentioned in the book many, many times, is this idea of getting in touch with your awareness, or recognizing your own simple awareness. And I direct people, or in the book, it directs people to ask themselves the simple question, am I aware? And in that question, the mind is bypassed, and that felt sense of awareness is recognized. Initially, we recognize that we recognize our awareness in relation to the fact that we're hearing things, we're seeing things. But when we ask ourselves the question, am I aware? We kind of go to, if you will, that sense of awareness and remain there. If we can remain there and abide as that, over time, it begins to reveal its qualities to us. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of hopefully it answers your question, or both questions. But it is very intangible, and really to maybe answer the last part of your question, it's missed because we give almost exclusive attention to our experience. We give attention to our thoughts and our feelings, what we see, our perceptions, what we hear, what we touch, what we taste. We don't give our attention. We haven't really been taught or directed to give our attention to that which is aware of all of that experience. For the most part, that's why it's kind of overlooked by most people, if you will.
Yeah. And this is giving rise to another question, which you talk about in your book at some point, the idea of who is observing. Is it, is it the watcher, the observer? Is that an essence of us in terms of soul? Is it the essence of us in terms of intellect? Who is it or is it none of those things? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. In the ultimate, the observation or the knowing, who is the perceiver when we ask ourselves this question, the sense of knowing any perception. When we think about observation, perception is probably the best way to tackle it. When we look at the knowing of that, the still point, our true nature, it is the only knowing entity, if you will. It's our very self. It isn't an entity, but it is the only thing that knows. This sense that we have, this sense that begins with the I am, that sense of being, that when we're able to say I am, this is really that first thought. If awareness or the unmanifest still point would have a first thought, it would be that I am thought. And from that point of I amness, we then begin as very young kids to pile on all of the stories on top of that. And that kind of becomes our story, our little me, the personality. And in a sense, we then believe that that is an independent entity that's doing the observing and the perceiving and all of that. When in fact that is a bit of an illusion. It is actually an illusion. I shouldn't say a bit of an illusion. So the only knowing aspect is really the still point itself, which is this. You can call it a field of awareness. It's just our very being itself.
What would you say that feels like to be in that still point? Does that feel like peace? Does that feel like the mind is silent?
Yeah, if you ask yourself the simple question, am I aware? And then remain as that. It's very difficult to quantify, but the best way that I think, again, because we're using words to denote what must be experiential,
Yes.
but it certainly is peace and happiness itself. And that is why abiding as that over and over again begins to reveal that happiness and that peace.
I think I'm asking you this question, well, for multiple reasons, but the one that comes to mind first is I also teach yoga and meditation, and oftentimes the response I get from people is that they cannot meditate because they can't stop their mind from thinking, or perhaps they can't, speaking of being still, sit still that long, maybe because the body is uncomfortable, or maybe because anxiety comes up. So I think it's first of all, I think it's interesting that the idea from the book you said, or the title came up in meditation. And I'm wondering I bet you hear this too from folks that you work with about, do you hear this too, that it's hard to meditate, or I cannot meditate because my mind won't stop thinking?
Sure.
Kind of a litany of not excuses. Well, I mean, sort of.
Well,
what do you say to those
I
comments?
think, yeah, no, I think in the book I mentioned that we recognize that we have, as humans, we tend to have a very short span of attention. And we kind of know that, if anyone who struggled to study for a test they didn't want to, study for, or whatever the case might be, we have an even shorter span of inattention, if you will. Because in a sense, the practice of abiding as the still point is to really relax the attention. And in relaxing that attention, we can abide in and as the still point. Now, we find out very quickly that our mind rebels against that, and thoughts come in rapid succession. The issue that we have, the problem that we have with that is we have been so conditioned to believe that our thoughts are what we are, that not only do we produce our thoughts, not only are we producing our thoughts, but the thoughts are our identity. And as a result of that, we're conditioned to follow those thoughts. We're conditioned to give our attention to those thoughts. And thought generates thought. When we have thoughts that are being generated by other thoughts, we have this kind of stream of incessant thinking, and that is in a sense the ego that's being filtered through, or coming through the ego, the sense of separation. So I always say that if it seems to be, it's on one hand, what we are as the still point is it's already present. We're already always that. So the idea of effort is a little bit of a paradox, but the reality is that if it seems like we need to make an effort, then we should make that effort. And that effort involves, as we said, it involves in really, again, recognizing the still point, abiding as that, and then letting the thoughts come and go without affirming them, without denying them, simply without attaching to them in any way. We can't control them arising, but we can control whether we give them our attention or not. And over time, you'll see that as we abide as the still point, we don't give the thoughts attention, they come less frequently. And just like removing the electricity from a fan, the fan will spin for a while, but eventually the fan will slow down. It's important to note we don't try to stop our thoughts. We don't try to control our mind or stop our thoughts. That would not be a free mind. It would not be an open mind. But simply not giving them our attention can get us into what we're calling meditation in a much more effective way.
Yeah, thank you. I love that answer. So I mentioned in the introduction of you that you are a rock musician, a medical doctor, a business executive, and the author of this beautiful book, The Still Point. When I say these things, and when I think about these different industries that you work in, it feels to me like there's a lot of different hats you must have to wear and different ways that you have to show up. And I'm wondering how this work of the still point maybe has influenced or was influenced by being in the medical field and in the business field.
Yeah, I mean, I think to be clear, I was in bands when I was 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and it's been a long time, from that perspective. But if you find out, if you write a book, you have to put something on there about yourself and about your past, and
yep.
And they were important, I think, experiences, if you will, that I had. Likewise, the same. I think that going to medical school, being a medical doctor, has little to do with the recognition of self. None of those things are required to recognize what we are or who we are. They were just the paths that I took to live my life in a sense. And in a way, we're until we turn around and we begin to make the begin to inquire and make the move inward, we're looking externally, and we're living our lives externally in a search for happiness. Everybody's looking to be happy, and everybody wants to be happy. And those were just the forms, if you will, that my life took, and the things that I did to try to go out and kind of acquire happiness. And ultimately, they don't work. No issue or problem with them in and of themselves, like pretty much any with anything in experience. But ultimately, this this path, if you will, this recognition, it came out of the failure, the failure and the suffering of many decades, and the questioning as to, is there another way? Is there a way to not be fearful, not be anxious, and to actually be happy?
Yeah. So would you say that after some amount of time in the business, executive, and medical field, that the fear and anxiety was just so much that you felt like you had to leave it or find a different path? I mean, it sounds like that's what you're saying. Like, you worked for a period of time in these industries and then realized this wasn't fulfilling you. It wasn't maybe bringing you happiness or joy, and then started to find meditation, self-realization.
Yeah, I think I mentioned in the book that, as the world would describe, everything looked perfect on the outside,
Mhm.
but there was not consistent happiness. And there was, since childhood, there was anxiety that would come and go, and
Mhm.
a lot of conflict in relationship, and eventually that led me to a Course in Miracles, which I did for about 10 years or so. And at the end of that period, there was, I guess, what you kind of call momentum, in that you can begin to see the actual changes in your life, in terms of a slow movement away from that egoic sense of separation. And it just became, in my case, it just became something that I had to give myself over to, more completely. And that really entailed turning away from all of it for a while, and really focusing more on this recognition of self. And I actually, I quickly after that point came to something called the direct path, which is really what the book is mostly about. And again, it was like a decade of A Course in Miracles, and then it became apparent that uh, I still needed something else, and this direct path came, and it very, very quickly, relatively, was able to put this into a perspective that went beyond intellectualizing or talking about it, to this felt knowing understanding of it.
Mm. Yeah. Mm. So, okay, so I have this question that I'm formulating in my head, but I feel like it might be hard to articulate, so bear with me. uh, I think a lot about habits and behaviors, like our daily rituals, how we bookend our days, how we set intention, these little decisions that we make every day that, whether they're conscious or they're unconscious, end up resulting in the way that we go through most of our lives. And sometimes that can be a whole lifetime. Sometimes that can be, a situation kind of like what you're describing, where you realize I need to make a change. And so I think the question that I'm trying to ask is, uh, thinking back on your life as a medical doctor, and the habits and behaviors that you might have had in place during that time in your life versus what kind of habits and behaviors or rituals, whatever you want to call them, today. Does your day-to-day look a lot different? um, let's start with that. Does your day-to-day look a lot different?
Well, when I was in those places, and doing the things you mentioned in those years and those decades, it was in a sense, there was a maniacal planning. You're always planning, and you're living very much in psychological time, and you're living by the calendar, and all of these things. And there's an aspect of that, an aspect that's necessary to move through the world. It's much different in that that isn't the case. The recognition over time really it concentrates living into the now, and there's this recognition of acceptance of what is, which essentially removes you as the individual planner, the individual doer, all of that. And in a sense, you live in the now, and as the now unfolds and expands, your primary job is just to accept it. And surprisingly, it's extremely practical because nothing is lost. It's not like you cease to function. It's not like you're unable to show up for events or to have things happen. It's just that control, the control that thought, that little entity, that little self believed it had, and it believed that it was kind of running the show. It's recognized that never really was the case, and life begins to flow in a much more open and in a much different way in that regard.
That sounds like an immense sense of freedom, and also I'm just comparing it to my daily existence, which is planned almost maniacally, like you mentioned, which is the irony in that is not lost on me.
Yeah.
So you have a chapter in your book, chapter 3, the seduction of thought. I think this is such a relevant and interesting concept, even in terms of what we were just talking about, like the construct of time and how we place these demands on ourselves and these ideas that we need to be somewhere at a certain time, we need to reach a certain level of success. What does that mean? So yeah, living in the present. I mean, what does that mean? That we have to let go of the ego completely? How does the intellect play into this? And like, once again, I find myself feeling like this is such an intangible thing, and I'm wanting to like have a list of things that I can draw on to help me come back to the present.
Yeah, the ego doesn't want to go away. The ego doesn't want to be let go of, and as a result of that, there's it will rebel. It rebels, and it rebels kind of in various ways. But I'm not maybe 100% sure what the question is, but it's more of once we recognize essentially what we are. So we have this recognition, as I mentioned, and then as we kind of abide as that, and we do this over and over again. We do it in the course of our everyday life. We do it when we sit down and what we call meditation. We begin, the mind begins to take on the qualities of the still point. And the qualities of the still point are that it's open, it's peaceful, it's completely accepting, it lacks nothing. So those kind of habits or those tendencies, they naturally fall away. It's not an effort, it's not behavioral control, which doesn't work. It ultimately doesn't work. So that's what I found to be very helpful when I came to this direct path and was able to go directly to that, our true nature. And again, just in time, these other habits and these proclivities we have of the ego in terms of trying to control and manage everything, they simply begin to fall away.
Yeah, it's not that I disagree with you. I do disagree with you, and I've experienced that myself when I spend more time in meditation, when I slow down, when I do things like take a digital detox day, I don't look at any of my devices, time naturally and simply just seems to settle. And I think that has a lot to do with my nervous system not being overstimulated all the time. So I do agree with you. I think uh and to answer your question, there, it wasn't really a question. I guess it was more like talk to me about this concept, which is what you did. So thank you.
Yeah.
um I think I do have a follow-on question in that, you know, when we spend time in intellect, which, well, let me start with this. Do you believe that intellect is the same as ego?
No, the ego is the belief that our identity is form, meaning that we believe that essentially what we are is the body and the mind. And there's a belief that for example, when the body dies, that what we are essentially will die or will not exist. And this is that existential fear of death that we have. So this is the ego. The intellect, when I talk about the mind, I'm really talking about thinking for the most part. And in fact, exclusively thoughts and everything that we kind of label that are nothing but thoughts, like memory and imagining or thinking about the so-called future and all of this. So there's no issue with thinking. That is not the ego. It is when we have this belief in being separate, isolated beings, meaning that we're all independent entities running around with our own consciousness. In that case, many of the thoughts that arise, they arise on behalf of that separate self. They arise on behalf of the egoic self and the sense of separation. And these are the thoughts that, in this approach that we take, that I talk about in the book, we discard those thoughts. And yet when thoughts arise from the whole mind, when thoughts arise from that recognition that consciousness is unified and that we all share that same consciousness, this is absolutely fine. So that's I think that's an important point that you mentioned, because a lot of people have an idea that thought is bad when they begin to move into self-realization and various forms of spirituality. And even, of course, we talked about in meditation, people somehow think that you can only meditate when you're not thinking or when thoughts are not coming. So no, thinking is okay, as long as the thinking is on behalf of the whole mind, not on behalf of the ego, on behalf of that sense of separation that that we have.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I have a kind of a personal question, I guess. I think that something that I struggle with, I'm sure I'm not alone in this, hopefully it's helpful to listeners, decision making from a place of fear versus a place of what I would call heart-centered, like or maybe intuition, or like that deep knowingness that this is the path for me. What can you talk to me a little bit about that? What are your thoughts on this concept?
Yeah, I think in general we should not make decisions from a place of fear, and that that distinction, however, that ability to distinguish whether these thoughts are coming on behalf of the ego or fear, we can say the same, we can put those into the same category, or on behalf of the whole mind. That's the getting to that point of that recognition is what takes a little work. And that's why this recognition of self and abiding as it's very important, because what it does is, when we recognize the self-aware being that we are, we come to see that thoughts arise from that. They last for a few seconds and then they dissolve back into that. There is this separation. Without that self-aware sense of being, no thought would be able to exist. It's not, it isn't possible. And that creates a little bit of separation. And we begin to spend more and more time recognizing that our self-aware nature is present, whether thought is present or not. You know, you are who you are before you think, during thinking, and after thought ends. You still are. Your awareness is still there, always available and always present. That begins to give us, Tessa, that ability to recognize when thoughts are arising on behalf of the split mind or the ego or fear, all the same, or they're arising in the whole mind. And then we can begin that living practice of simply discarding those that arise on behalf of fear, not following them. And what occurs is over time that the thoughts that come are more informed by the truth of our unity as a whole. And those can and should be celebrated and followed because they're inclusive. They're inclusive.
Would you say that that is a felt sense in the body? I often think of when, at least this is what I recognize in myself, when I get stuck in the head, the ego, or the fear, it almost feels like my head has detached from my body and it's just a floating head. And it does feel very challenging to tap, like the deeper truth, the quieter voice of the intuition. So would you say that there was, I don't know, maybe you've experienced this yourself or heard others have this experience of being almost like a somatic experience in the body of being able to tap into the deeper wisdom to guide you in decision making?
Yeah, absolutely. This approach, this is what in the spiritual traditions has been referred to more as the tantric approach. This approach of paying attention to your somatic experience, meaning that we sit without thinking about or attaching thoughts to the simple sensations and the vibrations of the body. This is a very very powerful and very helpful means of dealing with things like fear and anxiety and other kind of afflictive emotions. When we get to the point where we're able to sit and face the emotions, if you will, the sensations of the body alone, without placing thought onto them, without linking them to thought and then getting caught up in our mind, it's extremely, extremely powerful. There's a great non-dual teacher called John Klein who used to call this the highest art. It allows us to eventually recognize that the substance of our fear is love. When we sit and we there is no separation created between our aware being and those sensations of the body, which can be, we can call them heavy or have an intensity to them, but without the mind labeling, they remain neutral. And when we sit with those in time, their underlying substance of love is revealed. So yes, that's a very powerful and potent aspect of all of this, and I discussed that in the book a bit as well.
Yeah. So I think I heard what you said. The substance of our fear is love. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
I love that. That's such a beautiful, beautiful quotable moment. I'd like to talk about enlightenment, transcendence, kind of like the pinnacle of the path that we're walking, if we're working towards this spiritual transcendence. I don't know if I have a specific question, but would you kind of like jump off with whatever comes to mind with that?
Yeah. Well, if there's any ultimate pinnacle from which you no longer have any work to do, or no longer have anything else to do, you'd have to ask somebody else, because this is it's an ongoing process, and I'm sure it's a lifelong process. The part that is described as liberation or enlightenment, whatever word you want to use. Again, words are just pointers. This is the recognition, the simple recognition of our being as it is, and the further recognition of the qualities of that being, meaning that it's ever present and that it's whole, it's complete. You could use the words infinite and eternal. The mind grapples with those words a bit, but when you recognize that it's ever present and it does not come and go, is really and that is seen very clearly. It eliminates the fear of death. It eliminates the fear of non-existence. The recognition that it is infinite. It is without borders. It's whole. It's complete. It has no boundaries. It eliminates the fear of lack. And this is what's typically referred to as liberation, salvation, enlightenment. Again, you can use a lot of words. Mm-hmm. However, after this recognition is clear, and that's a wonderful realization, a wonderful realization. There is a tremendous amount of egoic conditioning that we have laid down over our entire lives, decades and decades of conditioning. And this conditioning does not wash out immediately. It doesn't wash out overnight. This is a continual process of realigning the way you live, the way you interact, the way you think, the way you relate, the way you feel the way you feel, and to that understanding. So I think in so many ways, the word enlightenment or salvation or liberation, they're extremely misunderstood in the world. And if this were a marathon, we could call it a marathon that doesn't end, but if this were a marathon of 23 miles or whatever marathons are, enlightenment might be the first 4 or 5 miles of it, and then all the rest, this ongoing state, is this realignment, if you want to call it, of all this conditioning that we have to be in alignment with that recognition.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So when I think about enlightenment, transcendence, the idea of reaching your highest potential, sometimes my mind goes to this place where I start to question, okay, well then what is the purpose of life? Is it that we reach this state in this particular earthly body? We came here to learn a particular lesson or to maybe accomplish that. And then does that mean this body, we no longer need it? It sounds kind of like what you're saying is that's really just the beginning of the process. Then it's like this ebb and flow of dealing with the decades of washing away the ego. And it's really kind of like maybe like a pendulum swing sometimes, maybe more like a gentle rolling hill. I'm sure that changes depending on what it is you're experiencing, what lessons you need to learn. So I think what I want to ask you next is your thoughts on what is the purpose of life then? That's happy. A big question, right? So
happiness, to be happy. It's a simple question, and it's an absolute answer. There's very few things that we can say with certainty, but the purpose of life is to be happy, and every human is looking for happiness. If they are acting in ways that seem unconscious, they're still doing what they do because they believe it will bring them happiness. So that's the purpose. That's the purpose of life. And it's true that with this very clear seeing of our true nature, that happiness and peace are there. It's not, you'll hear this described as bliss and all these words that flowery and whatnot, and that's a little much. There are times when, of course, it becomes, more bubbles over, if you will. Is maybe a good way to say it, but it's peace and it's happiness. And while you're going through the phase, which is a never-ending phase, I would have to say, in my experience, of this realignment, that recognition is there. That recognition doesn't slip away, so to speak. You may act at times in a way that is inconsistent with it, and yet, as you progress, it's quickly recognized. That happens less and less, and when you do, you'll move right back into living more in alignment with it. But yeah, just the purpose of life is to be happy.
I love that. You're right. That does sound simple. So and you're touching on this, but I do want to underscore the idea that, okay, so let's say we agree that the purpose of life is happiness, and then the pendulum's going to swing, and the human experience will bring us suffering and pain inevitably. Is that purposeful? Is that meant to teach us something? Is that yeah
I think that suffering is the way to God, in a sense. Suffering is the way to this understanding, and I say that because in my experience, it's directly true. And certainly, most all of the religious and spiritual traditions at their core recognize that. Because ultimately, suffering is resistance to what is. Suffering is not contained in the circumstance as it happens. It's contained in our interpretation of that. And when we interpret circumstances with resistance, and we resist what is, we suffer. So when we recognize our true nature as the still point, self-aware being, it is resistanceless itself. And as the mind realigns to that, resistance drops, and then suffering drops. Pain doesn't go away. It's important. Pain doesn't go away. Circumstances that are challenging, still happen and whatnot. But your tendency to resist them and to, always be looking for something better than what is, that is what is diminished, over time.
Yeah, I love that. So you have this you mentioned it before in our talk, the direct approach. Can you explain to me a little bit more about what that means? It's also in the book, but I want to hear in your words what the direct approach is.
Yeah, the direct approach goes directly to the recognition of our self-aware being. So in asking the question, am I aware? We pause. And before we say yes, it's because we've gone to that experience. So it's direct. We're not progressively trying to thin out the ego. We're not progressively trying to purify, the ego in this particular approach. It's also, I think, important to note that it's direct in that it has no cultural or social baggage associated with it. We don't talk about, we don't wear certain clothes, we don't eat certain foods, you don't sit in a particular position to meditate. And all of that is stripped away. And there are, and I think that's in many ways, it's very appropriate for the world we're living in today. I think many people are ready for this more direct approach to recognizing their true nature.
Yeah. So I love the simplicity of that, just pausing and asking, am I aware? When I think about that exercise, my follow-up question in my head is, well, am I aware of what?
Yeah, that's right. And this isn't about what you're aware of. It's about the awareness itself.
Mhm.
That's very important, so, ultimately, it's not something to think about. It's something to recognize. You
Mhm.
are already yourself. You are you. You have a sense of you. Your being is always present. And when you ask yourself, am I aware? There's no thought involved in that. That awareness is recognized as a felt sense of being, and you abide in and as that. The mind is going to come in and try to take you in a million different places, and the reason why that simple, most obvious recognition that we all have is overlooked is because we are, for the most part, only interested in the things we are aware of, as opposed to the awareness which knows them.
Mm. I love that restating. Thank you. Okay, so I want to ask one last question. It's it's kind of a two-part. Well, I'll explain. So, I am a lover of poetry. I've actually written a book of poetry, and one of my inspirations, my go-to all-time favorite poets, is Mary Oliver, and a section of one of her poems is just a line, and it says, "Tell me, what is it you will do with your one wild and precious life?" And so the way that I'm turning this into a question for you is, you could answer it that way, which I feel like the still point is part of the answer for you. But don't let me put words in your mouth. But the more direct question is, what are you looking forward to?
I'm enjoying this now. It's really living in the now. I'm enjoying this now. It's the present moment is. I've spent most of my life overlooking it, and always regretting the past or thinking about what might be in the future, and it's too precious to overlook. So, it's living in the now, and uh, it. It it is truly that, and life flows from the now. I do think that it's important that people follow their bliss. I love Joseph Campbell, and the great comparative mythologist who who said follow your bliss. And I think that it's very important for people that if they're still in whatever phase they're in, if they're still in a phase where they are excited about seeking for happiness externally, they should not be stopped from doing that. They should follow their bliss and do that until they come to that own recognition that maybe it can't be found outside of me, and then they can turn around. But that has to be an individual choice. We all have to make that choice individually. So in my case, when that happened, and that was my bliss, and it was truly something that was very, very powerful in that. So yeah, the book came out of that, and being able to have wonderful conversations like this come out of it. And what will be, what will is what will be. It's not really, it's not planned out, or it's not really thought about. I couldn't say what I'll be doing in a year from now. I have absolutely no idea.
Very good. Thank you so much, Kevin. I really appreciate your time. Where can people go to find out more about you or connect with you?
Yeah, so the book will be released March 1st, and Amazon. It can be pre-ordered, or hardcover or audiobook first. There's a website, author kevinkrenitsky.com, which is a way to also pre-order the book, and maybe eventually there'll be some other content on there as well.
Great. Well, I'll make sure that all of those resources and links go into the show notes so people can get their hands on a copy of this book. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your wisdom, your grace, for showing up and being with us today.
Thank you, Tessa. It was wonderful. Have a great day.
You too. Well, everyone, that concludes another amazing episode of Outside the Studio. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you learned something new, maybe remembered something old, maybe felt inspired to apply something to your life. You can hear my dog in the background. She's doing a little happy dance. So Daisy enjoyed it. Anyhow, I wanted to just pop in here to wrap us up to say a couple of things. Number one, I have such an amazing team that helps me put these podcasts together. Without them, I wouldn't, be able to bring these amazing conversations to you. So thank you to my producer, my director of creative services, my sound editor, my engineer, Consistency Media. Don't know what I would do without you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And the amazing creation and artistic, musical genius, Drew Lovern. Thank you so much for putting together this music specifically for outside the studio. So unique to the show, only place you're ever going to hear it is right here. Thanks, you guys. You make my world go round. Stay well, everyone. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review, share on the socials, especially if it's a show that you think, hey, this could help somebody else. That's what this is all about, right? We're sharing information so that we're better, so that we're inspired, so that we're lifting each other up, and we're learning how to be in this world, living on this planet to the best of our ability, sharing information and inspiring one another. And that's my hope. That's my hope for the show. Take care.